Hello, Lakeview family. Hope you all are staying cool in the midst of this crazy heat. It is Thursday morning when I'm recording this, so a day after the awesome torrential, or maybe not torrential, but significant downpour and storm. Spent some time thanking the Lord for that. It was very refreshing. And also praying that the lightning didn't cause any more fires and that the rain helped put out some that were burning. So just continue to be praying for, especially the people that are fighting those fires and those that are being forced to evacuate, both from the fire in Eastern Oregon and others that are burning in parts of our region and I'm sure around the world. These are tough times. So, speaking of tough, our passage for Sunday, many would say is tough, and I think probably that's very true. But I think I enjoy the tough ones. Causes me to study more, lean in, and just rely on the Lord to give words and guide the conversation and my thoughts. So I'm excited to talk about the story of King David's failure, King David's taking, as you will hear me talk about a lot. And I'll probably reference a lot of times this is referred to as the story of David and Bathsheba, and I think, in some ways, at least for me at this time, for me, as I study this and lead us through this in terms of particularly this series of Keeping Up with Jesus, Not the Joneses, I'm going to put full focus and energy of this text on David, because really that's where it lies, and he is the sole responsible party for what happens in all of these events. And unfortunately, I think over the years, in part, and I'll reference this maybe on Sunday, but in part because of what I think is a disillusioned kind of purity culture that existed, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s, and even sometimes still continues to grab a hold of the church because of that perspective and our admiration for David and this idea of him being a man after God's own heart. We have to kind of shield him a little bit from the responsibility, and I think that's inappropriate. I think that does not help David. David doesn't even do that to himself. If you read Psalm 51, if you read his response to Nathan the prophet, if you watch his journey through the loss of the son that came about from this rape and adulterous affair, you will see that David recognizes his responsibility in this and takes ownership, and I believe brings some correction to what was the slow creep of comparison that we've talked about, an unsurrendered life that David had began to live as a result, I think in some ways of getting comfortable. And you hear me say this, and I want to be careful. I don't want to project. And ultimately, anytime we're interpreting a text or coming to it, we're going to do that, right? We're going to read it through a lens. We oftentimes, and really, you can't help but do that. So I think to just own that up front and to say, I'm looking at this through my own lenses, right, of a 21st century white male pastor who himself lives in a space of comfort and power and privilege and pride. These things three words that I'll talk about in our text on Sunday. So I recognize I come to it with that, but trying to take a different perspective, a different slant. And some of that is just changing how we even initially talk about it. So not calling it the story of David and Bathsheba, but of David's taking. Like he takes something that is not his. So this is a story of David taking what was not his, which teaches us the danger, right, of pride, power, and privilege. Three things that David had found that we all can find in our ways when we find ourselves coming into places of power, which happens on different levels. Like for David, he was king, so like his ultimate position of power. But all of us experience those things, power, privilege, pride, in different ways and different levels. Whether it's, kids, once you become like a senior in high school and you're the big person on campus, like there's certain amounts of natural kind of power that comes to you because of the way in which our lives are formed and shaped, which is maybe indifferent at best, not necessarily good or bad, but can be used for good or bad, right? So all of us can experience this as parents, as an HOA president. Like one of my favorite things to make fun of and point out how power can really get to people's heads and how people literally are always grasping for it. We see it play out in our politics, of course, and institutions, and the church is not immune to this. And you'll hear me reference part of what is hard for me in this text is, now that I'm over, 20 years of ministry, pastoral ministry, and looking back and have no fewer than 10 people who I would say have been, and some still are, friends of mine who have got themselves caught up in these situations of pride, power, and privilege, and like David, have taken what wasn't theirs and have had some kind of moral failure. And I don't know about you, but for me, then texts like this, I read them differently. I read them as warning. I read them as, and I read those stories as not just a warning, but how close these things are to us when we are not careful and vigilant. And I want to be careful too, because then the response isn't putting some kind of rigid structure over top of myself or us as individuals in our journey. It is simply reminding ourselves that our true source and our focus ought to be God, right? It's choosing God or other than God. So, the kryptonite to power, pride, and privilege is simply humble surrender and deep, intimate relationship with Jesus, right? And putting Jesus above Joneses, making my focus to be Jesus and his call for me on my life, which oftentimes will always look radically different than what the world would show me or things that I could find moving toward areas of pride, power, and privilege, things that feel good in the flesh, that in some senses aren't bad, like becoming a lead pastor or elevating oneself in your organization or assuming greater positions of power or prestige or all of the things. Those aren't evil in and of themselves, but it's the posture in which we hold those, because it is not difficult for all of us who can be at some point in our lives like David and be people after God's own heart, and over time find ourselves in the slow creep of comparison and unsurrendered comparison. We find ourselves in situations where we're on a rooftop and we make decisions and we instruct people to do things because we have power and privilege. We instruct things like pawns in our game to get what we want and then to cover up what we got because we are found out. Like, these things just happen. So looking at this text to help us understand how to avoid, and as God instructs, like God selflessly gives to people. And we see this ultimately in the form of the giving of his son, Jesus. Kings selfishly take, which he instructs through Samuel, that this is what kings will do. And while it doesn't say he'll take daughters and sleep with them and have his own children, but he talks about taking daughters and sons essentially for the king's own good and growth of his own image and his own kingdom. So the warnings are certainly there. And in the midst of all of this stuff, right, we see God continue to work out God's plan. Now, what we want to be careful to make sure we don't say theologically, which you've heard a lot of this same kind of conversation around the attempted assassination on Trump. Once people are, God saved Trump, so God didn't save the guy who died. Like, making sure that our theology lines up with who God actually is, and recognizing what it is we're saying, and also just asking the motivation. Why do we need to say that? What are we trying to prop up or present in saying that? And so in this situation, God doesn't cause this to happen so that God can work out God's plan. God has a plan, and I believe what God wanted to do through the line of David could have happened, and we could have got to the person of Jesus without all of this mess, even though this mess is in the lineage, right? Like, God works in the midst of whatever things come about and continues to be faithful and course correct to make sure that things move the direction that God desires. And so it's a way and a theology of thinking about God's very Wesleyan. And I don't know how much of that we'll unpack on Sunday, but that's certainly fun to think about. There's great hope in this text in that we see the response of David. We see repentance. We see conviction and confrontation and accountability from the prophet Nathan, which a lot of times is also non-existent in the church. These are things that we need to see happen. There are absolutely consequences to our actions, and there must be accountability. And grace doesn't mean a free pass and that we just forget about it, because of what that does to all those involved. Right? There needs to be a humanizing of those who have been dehumanized, and there needs to be a humbling of those who have been prideful. And this is the course correct that we see is a part of the story of God and how God works and what it means to be in community. So there's hope in that God still works out God's plan and purpose. And there's a reminder, right? There's wisdom of Uriah's descent when David brings him home, try to get him to sleep with Bathsheba so he can kind of wash his hands of this whole thing. Like there's a loyalty that Uriah has both to the crown and to his comrades in battle and to his country that he refuses. He doesn't go home. He doesn't rest. He doesn't stop doing what is normal to be done, which is exactly what David did. David stopped going out to battle in the spring, which is what got him in this situation in the first place. So you see a counter of that in what Uriah does. And you also, over the course of Bathsheba's life, advocating for Solomon to continue to take the throne, even when Adonijah wants to kind of assume the throne inappropriately and kind of subvert God's plan. Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan step in with David to make that happen. And then Solomon essentially makes Bathsheba the first queen mother, because the line of David continues through Solomon all the way to Jesus, that provides for Bathsheba a sense of royalty among that line and a place that is remembered and revered and should be. The rise and kind of bringing herself up from that experience and not allowing it to define her, but to step into her role as a part of God's plan that God worked out. So interesting text, and I hope we learn some things together from this. So have a great rest of your week. Blessings, my friends.